As your programs start to get larger and more complex, it becomes important to organize all of the pieces that go into them. Also, you might find that you can reuse some of these pieces. Instead of copying and pasting code, we organize these reusable pieces into something we call functions. A function is a bit of code that you can reuse whenever you need it. You've used functions written by others that are built in with Python, such as print and input. In this video, you'll learn how to write your own. In order to use your own function in Python, you need to define it. Let's look at a simple function and discuss what each of the pieces are that we use to define a function. In this example, def is a keyword that stands for define. It signals to Python that we are defining a function. Next, we give the function a name. In this example, welcome is the name of the function. Right after the name, there are a set of parentheses, and that's followed by a colon. The parentheses can contain what are called parameters, or they can be empty. This particular function doesn't need any information from outside the function in order to do its job, so there are no parameters in the parentheses. The colon begins a code block, just like it does with an if statement or a for loop. The string surrounded by triple quotes is called a documentation string, or docstring for short. This is where we can describe what the function does and include any other useful information for someone that might use our function. It's not required, but it's helpful, especially if our function is complicated. In this example, we simply state the purpose of the function, which is to display a welcome message. Next, we put the code we want to run when our function is used or called. Notice that everything after the colon, including the docstring, is indented. Similar to other code blocks, when we stop indenting, the code block ends, which will be the end of our function. This function simply prints a welcome message. It's not that useful because it's so simple, but we want to start out simple. The last thing we see here is return. This is a keyword and it is used to define what will get sent back from our function. In this case, there's nothing after return, so it returns none. Return isn't required in our function if it doesn't return anything, but it's here in this example so we can mention it. But I'll delete it because we don't need it. Let's run our code and see what happens. Well, our message didn't print out, so why not? Well, we've defined our function well, but in order to run the code inside the function, we have to call the function. Calling a function is easy. You just use its name followed by parentheses. And if our function had parameters, we'd need to put something in the parentheses. But this function doesn't. So let's call our function. Since the name is welcome, we'll just type welcome with an empty set of parentheses. Now let's run it and see if it works. Wonderful! Welcome to the function factory. It worked. We've defined and called our own function. It's good practice to put your function definitions at the top of your code file. Then when you need to use them, just call them with their name. The functions won't run until they are called, but Python will keep track of them so they can be executed later in our code. Now, let's do something different. Let's change our function just a little so that it is personalized by using a parameter. To personalize the message, we need to know the name we need to include in our message. This means that our function needs to know the name. So we'll add a parameter inside the parentheses. The parameter will be a variable that the function can use. We'll use name in this case. And then we need to change our message so we can use name in the message. We'll say, hello name, welcome to the function factory. Now, let's run this and see how it works. Uh-oh, we got an error. Well, that's because when we called our function, we didn't give it a parameter. Notice it says missing one required positional argument, name. So we need to get that information from the user, or we could hard code it. Well, let's get it from the user. Since we need the information before we call the function, we're going to need to get it from the user before we call welcome. So we'll say User equals input. What is your name? Now we're not quite done. Notice that user is a variable outside of the function. When we call a function and put a variable name in the parentheses, that's called an argument, and the value of the argument will be passed to the parameter in the function definition. We still need to put that argument in our welcome call. This is how we send information from outside of the function into the function so it can be used. So here we're going to type in user in the parentheses. It's important to recognize when you're defining a function that you'll need parameters for any information that is needed inside the function, but is created or defined outside of the function. So when you define a function, ask yourself, what information does this function need in order to do its job? And that will help you know what parameters you need. So let's run this code and see how it works. It's going to ask for my name, which I'm Christy, and voila, hello Christy, welcome to the function factory. It worked great. Now, this is a very simple example, but functions are powerful tools in programming, and there are a lot more details you'll learn to make them more powerful. Think of some tasks you'd like Python to perform and see if you can write a function that performs that task.